And with that, I will hand things over to Sophie. Thank you.
Hi everyone, like Dan said, I'm Sophie. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to read the land acknowledgement now. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Mary Greagan. Mary Greagan is an avid outdoor enthusiast who has grown up loving nature. She's a Bethlehem resident growing up, and Mary earned her associates in fisheries and wildlife technology and her bachelor's in wildlife management from SUNY Cobleskill before going on to earn her master's in biodiversity, conservation, and policy from SUNY Albany. And Mary specializes in environmental education, invasive species analysis, and is also a wildland firefighter. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary, and I hope you all enjoy the talk tonight.
Thank you very much. My name is Mary Greagan, and I'm really happy to be with you all tonight to talk about and there's my dog, perfect timing, to talk about some really important things that happened in our natural history of New York that we don't really think about, but without, we wouldn't have the ecosystems that we have today. So going off a little bit of my background, I have my bachelor's in wildlife management and my master's in biodiversity, conservation, and policy. I am a certified associate wildlife biologist through the Wildlife Society. I was a Rensselaer Land Trust volunteer and invasive species consultant, as well as a member of the board. So I am a pretty passionate volunteer with the Rensselaer Land Trust, and I hope to be able to continue that into the new merged Rensselaer Plateau Alliance and Rensselaer Land Trust. And in my free time, I am a runner, I'm an artist, a hiker, and a photographer. So I know that I said in the discussion that this was going to be about snow, but we're not starting with snow. We have to start out with the fact that a long time ago, first, it was a little hot. And you might be wondering, is this important considering that we were going to talk about snow? Yes, it's extremely important. And I want to talk first about something known as lava bubbles. It's thanks to lava bubbles, and as funny as that may sound, they're very much real things, and they are responsible for creating New York as we know it today. Back when the Earth was still forming, lava bubbles would be growing and pushing up against the crust of the Earth. Over time, these bubbles would solidify, and they would form into our mountains. New York has some of the oldest rock in the world, which is in the Adirondack Mountains. And these are from the first lava bubbles that ever actually solidified. How do we know this? Through a very intense geological study that I don't understand, but I can just tell you that we know that New York has some of the oldest rocks in the world. If you want to learn more about this, the Wild Center up in Tupper Lake has a very good display about how these rocks formed and how they were able to age them. So a little bit of a pledge for the Wild Center. So while it was hot for a long time, then it was not. Here's where we're going to get into the cold weather. After a few thousand million years, things began to cool off. But why? Why did this happen? Well, one very common hypothesis is that the orbit and the alignment for the Earth shifted. We have the seasons that we have today because the Earth rotates on an axis on an angle. But when the Earth was first forming and there was a lot of space stuff flying around out there, the Earth would often get hit with a lot of different space debris. There's a thought that one of these pieces of debris hit so hard that the Earth was knocked off of its normal alignment. It's also worth considering, though, that climates naturally shift. From approximately 2.58 million years ago to 11,700 years ago, temperatures had shifted and changed and eventually plummeted, leaving a vast ice sheet covering more than half of North America. This picture is a diagram of the last ice age that covered North America, known as the Laurentide ice sheet, along with the Cordilleran ice sheet. Ice came all the way down almost a quarter of the United States. This star that you see is the approximate location of Albany, so we would have been very chilly if we were living in that time. It's kind of hard to fathom just how much ice comes with an ice age. I imagine it's probably a lot. It's called the ice age for a reason. On average, the ice was about 2 miles thick. Now, one thing that we have to remember with ice ages is it's not a constant stretch of just a big chunk of ice. There would be periodic warming and cooling spells, but these spells would only last a couple hundred to a couple thousand years before dropping again and having the cold weather come back in. So it was still classified as an ice age, but the ice age had many different seasons within it. The primary ecosystem was tundra. These tundras are still remnant today up in the high north into the Arctic Circle, in Greenland, parts of Canada, stretching up towards the North Pole, where it then goes back to ice. The tundra consists of smaller plants that do not need excessive sunlight or heat to survive, or soil to put down their roots. These plants are mosses, lichens, small flowering plants, and conifers. But nothing lasts forever.
And so before
Couple
we,
thousand years ago.
oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
Mary. Before
I'm
we
sorry,
move
I
on,
got ahead of myself.
just a quick question from the chat. If something hit Earth hard enough to shift it off its axis, would that leave behind a giant crater?
It depends on when this happened. If the Earth was still in its, I'm going to call it softball stage, a candy term, but it's pretty accurate. If the Earth was still mostly molten rock and lava and still fairly malleable, it would most likely absorb that rock that hit, but it could still have that shock wave that would cause it to go off kilter. Now, that's just one theory. Obviously, there's several craters left from different asteroids and comets and space junk that hit when the Earth was forming. So it can be a little hard to determine exactly what happened, which one maybe caused that ice age. But doing different dating based on looking at the structures and the rocks and the layers, you can kind of identify it. However, the fact that the theory that it was knocked off kilter from something hitting it, it's kind of a theory, but there's not a whole lot of evidence yet. Maybe there will be, depends on what we discover. Any other questions before we move on? All right. So about 19,000 years ago, the climate changed again, but this time the warming didn't stop. What happens when the temperature is warm? Ice doesn't just melt, it would retreat. And we say it's retreating, but what's happening is the ice is shrinking. As it melts, its border is being pushed back. Now, ice, if you've ever dropped a piece of ice on the ground and picked it back up, you know that sometimes it picks up stuff with it. Imagine this on a much larger scale, about the size of a country. As the ice began to leave, it was not a clean exit, and it left its mark on the Earth and on New York. And that is where a lot of our ecology and natural history comes from. We can call these scars on the landscape. As the ice retreated, it left its mark in a few ways. It left us hollows. It left us lakes, a few rivers, something called erratics. And today we still have some remnant tundra ecosystem left from this time. So let's talk about hollows. As the glacier retreated, these are large glacial pieces pulling the land as they move. But as it pulls, the water that gets left behind doesn't immediately drain away. As a result, a vast lake was formed. This lake was connected with rivers, ancient rivers, also carved from the shifting ice. One of these rivers was the present-day Mohawk River. This glacial hollow that was full of water This was once known as Glacial Lake Albany, stretching for dozens of miles. And if we were around a couple thousand years ago, we would all be underwater right now. Eventually, the water did drain, leaving us the landscape that we know today as the Hudson Valley and the surrounding highlands and plateaus. Oh, excuse me, plateaus. The ice, as it moved, also scraped across the mountains, which ended up lowering their elevation. And like I said, we got to remember, these are big chunks of ice. They're doing some damage. At one time, the Adirondacks were actually higher than the Himalayas. But due to the shifting ice, dragging and pulling and scraping back and forth across the landscape, those mountains shortened to the ones that we have today. Glaciers formed U-shaped valleys as they retreated. These are iconic for glaciers, just like rivers carve V's in the landscape. So if you see a giant U shape on the landscape, then you're looking at a glacial valley and you are seeing a path that a glacier took as it moved. How about lakes? There were many different lakes that formed as glaciers retreated. There are two main types, scrapes and glacial profiles. Like I said, the ice would scrape across the landscape, carving as it went. These gave us the Finger Lakes. The Finger Lakes are all glacial lakes that resulted as the glacier pulled up north, scraping away as it went. There's also glacial profiles. These formed a few different ways. Glacial profiles could either be a chunk of ice dropping off of a glacier and falling into the ground, leaving a depression that would eventually fill with water. The glacial profile could also be just a hollow that was left behind when the glacier sat for a while. This is how we were given the Great Lakes. All of these Great Lakes are glacial profiles. If you look at a map of the Great Lakes, there's a few you can just look up online, the weird shapes and the different elevations underwater, you're basically looking at what a glacier is upside down. As ice began to break and retreat, water would flood down into the valleys that they left behind. And it was through this flooding that formed the Hudson River. And this was really where the start of New York's economic and ecological history really began to take off. The Hudson River is one of the most important ecological, economic, and social constructs in New York. It's responsible for trade, movement, recreation, wildlife habitat, and so many others. So we can thank a glacier for giving us our most important tool in Eastern New York. Now let's move on to my favorites. Erratics, or as I like to call them, who put that rock there? So have you ever been walking and noticed a large rock that was sitting somewhere kind of weird? Like it just fell out of the sky. Well, glaciers would carry sediment and rocks as they moved. Stuff would get stuck. And you can try this with yourself. Like I said, if you take an ice cube and you go out into your garden and you stick it in the soil and you pick it up, it's going to pick up sediment with you. You're basically making a small glacier on a very little scale. So these glaciers would carry sediment. They would carry rocks as they moved. But gravity is strong and stuff has a tendency to fall, especially if it's heavy. As the glaciers moved and melted, materials would drop off, and there they would sit. If they didn't have a force like gravity to continue pulling them down a slope, that's where they would sit. You can see a lot of these up in the Adirondacks and in a lot of different ecosystems around us. If you're in an area that's not really near a cliff, that's not on a slope, and you just see a big rock, you're most likely looking at a glacial erratic. Now, alpine ecosystems are one of our rare treasures in New York, left from the last ice age. These are remnant plants that lived during the ice age and they hung on. These two plants here are two that are found in New York. The top one is called Dipensia, and the bottom one is Lapland rosebay. These plants are traditionally found at approximately past 40,000 feet in elevation at the end of a tree line. If we've got folks in here who like to hike the Adirondacks, especially the high peaks, you'll know that when you're going through some of the higher peaks, you're going to reach a point where suddenly the trees stop or they get much smaller. This is because you have passed the zone where there's either enough soil or enough favorable conditions for taller trees to grow. This is where our alpine ecosystems are now the present. These are very hardy plants and they are long-lived. Some of these plants, like the two that you're seeing here, could be over 100 years old. And they're pretty strong. They survived pretty rough environments. But these are the last living pieces of the Ice Age, and there's not a lot of place left for them. So stewardship is huge in their preservation. Like I said, if you're up on the high peaks in the Adirondacks and you see these plants, most likely you're also going to see a summit steward with them who are educating and helping keep people off from trampling them, because these are pretty small. If you're not watching your step, you could step on them. To give you an idea of just how rare these plants are, there's only about 100 acres of total alpine vegetation left in the Adirondacks. The Adirondacks is approximately 6 million square miles. So that just gives you an idea of how small and precious this ecosystem is. Do we have any other questions so far?
Yes. So we have one more question. Do we know why the Finger Lakes are confined to just one area of New York State?
So as far as how the glacier forms, it's really kind of hit or miss. There's a bunch of different factors. It could be that the land, regarding the landscape that was under it first, it could just be the pattern in which the ice was melting and the pattern in which it was moving. It is one of those questions where it's really a world of theory. We don't really know exactly how the glacier picks and chooses where things happen. It's pretty just a matter of circumstance, or it could just be pure luck. Any other questions before we move on?
No, we're all set to move on.
All right. So now we're going to get into my favorite part of the Ice Age, about some big footprints in the past. And for those of you who are familiar with the Albany Cohoes area, you'll know what I'm getting at. Around 1866, long after the Ice Age had ended, some constructors uncovered some bones in Cohoes, New York. There was some other stuff happening in the 1800s, but we'll get to that in a second. What these bones ended up being was a mastodon, an ancient elephant from the last Ice Age. Through some studying, it was determined to be a male, and it turns out he died from a head trauma. Back then, it was rough living. Not only did you have other male mastodons to contend with, you had a lot of cold weather, not much food, and a lot of brutal ice storms. So it was determined that this poor guy had bad luck with his head. This was one of the most important discoveries for Cohoes and for New York in general. It gave us a tangible thing to look at that showed a picture of the last Ice Age. Today, the Cohoes mastodon lives in the New York State Museum. If you haven't gone yet, I highly encourage it. It's quite a sight to see. I have been to the museum more times than I can count, and this is always one of my favorite spots to go. So what about New York's ecosystems today? Can we still see the Ice Age in the ecosystem? Do we still experience the Ice Age to a degree? The answer is yes, to a degree. We have mountainous regions with colder climates. We have hollows in the valleys. We have plateaus as a result of those ice scrapes pushing and changing across the landscape. We have highlands. Generally, we have a colder climate with forests, boreal and temperate. We have conifers that are very cold hardy, and we have maple trees that are responsible for our sugar industry. And it's thanks to these cold hardy trees that the sap that flows in the trees is able to produce the maple syrup that we all know and love. So generally, New York is considered a colder climate. Well, it's not so cold anymore. Temperatures are warming at an accelerated pace, and overall snowfall is diminishing. Last year was the first year, I think ever, if not in a very long time, that Lake George did not freeze at all. And we may not see the Hudson River freeze this year. It is natural for climates to change. We've seen this. We've seen it happen in the past. We will continue to see it happen in the future. However, we are accelerating, our climate is accelerating at a much faster pace than what is normal. Now, remember what I said about there was some stuff happening in the 1800s? This is where we can kind of see where things began to really change. The late 1800s leading into the 1900s was when the Industrial Revolution really began to take off. People began vacating their farmlands and open fields and began going to the factories and the refineries. There was wood that was used as fuel. Coal began to be discovered. And all of those emissions began pumping out into the atmosphere. Through these emissions, we began to see well-known greenhouse gases. Earth is pretty good at keeping heat in. It was able to keep it in for a long time, but now we're helping it keep even more in. There is extra heat coming from these emissions that cannot be burned away or dissipate. And unfortunately, pretty much all of our environment is suffering because of it. This is a picture of a river that burned because of an oil spill. Now, this actually wasn't the first time this river had burned before due to the pollutants and the oil within it, but this was kind of the wake-up call. Like, we need to do something, and we need to change some things if we're going to survive. Overall, we have to be mindful of our resource use. That is one of the most important things that we can do. Keep track of how many emissions you may be creating. Maybe walk instead of go on a car ride. Can you hang up your laundry rather than use your dryer? Practice green activities like recycling. This is critical, especially considering how much plastic we produce as a society. That plastic is very hard to make. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of resources to make it, and it stays in the landscape. And when it burns or when it gets destroyed, it creates a lot of disgusting stuff that also goes into the atmosphere. It's also important to tell others, educate others about what they can do. And one of the things that I have encountered a lot with people, it's like, it's such a daunting task. What can I do? What can one person do to help keep the landscape safe? And this is where I want to tell a little story. It's the story of the starfish. There was a wise man who was walking along a beach after a great storm. And all along the beach, there were thousands of starfish sitting on the sand. As the man walked along, he met a boy who was throwing the starfish back into the ocean. And he goes to the boy and he says, "Young man, what are you doing?" And the boy said, "I'm tossing the starfish back in. Otherwise, they'll dry up on the beach." And the man says, "But young one, there are so many starfish, you can't possibly make a difference." And the boy picked up another starfish and he threw it back into the ocean. And he said, "It made a difference for that starfish." So while the activities that we do on an individual scale may not seem like a lot, it may not seem like it does a whole lot for the world, when we put them all together, that's when we can literally move glaciers. If you want to learn more about the climate changing with the different temperatures and how just a tiny bit of a temperature change could change the world, I would recommend this documentary by National Geographic. It's called 6 Degrees Could Change the World. To give you a little bit of a spoiler, it was 1 degree difference in global temperature that caused us to have the last ice age. But now we're seeing it on the other side. It's getting warmer. So if 1 degree difference could create an ice age, what would happen if there was 6 degrees? So thank you for listening to this brief story into Earth's long existence. And if there are other questions, I would be glad to take them at this time.
Thanks so much, Mary. Currently, we don't have any questions in the chat, but I'll give people a little bit of time to type up any questions they might have. I actually have a question. So our most recent cooler period in Earth's history, I believe, was the Little Ice Age. And I'm just wondering, Do you think that the Industrial Revolution you discussed accelerated us out of this cooling time period and was supposed to last longer? Or do you think we're in sort of like a natural warming cycle of the Earth and that anthropogenic effects are accelerating that natural warming?
So climatologists predict that just based on going through different warming and cooling periods, looking at just strictly the Earth warming and cooling on its own, we are actually overdue for another little ice age. And that hasn't happened. So, and that is because of our industrial output, the greenhouse gases that we produce, how many cars or how many vehicles we have on the road. And the thing is, we have to be mindful that there are some of these that are unavoidable just given the circumstance of life. But other things that we can do, we should do to try to diminish the extra heat that we're putting out into the world. If everybody turned down their thermostat just 5 degrees, it would save approximately 500,000 barrels of oil a day, especially during winter. Personally, I keep my house at 61 degrees in the winter. It's a little chilly, but I've got lots of nice warm sweaters and I've got a puppy. So it's cold, but if it means that it's helping the earth just a little bit, I'll do that.
Great, thank you. So we do have another question now in the chat. It takes a lot of water to make a 2-mile thick ice sheet. Given the amount of water on the Earth is finite, what was the source of the water that became all that ice?
So all the ice, this is the water cycle kind of on a whole. All the water that was on the Earth and within the atmosphere exists the same now as it did back then. It's just where it is. So at the time, all of the water was locked up into the ice sheets. But at another time, that was a warm, shallow sea. And what happens is just because a bunch of the water was locked up in the ice, that doesn't mean it was just poof, there's water. It was hanging out there for a long time. And the amount of water that we have now is going to be the same that we have in the future. It's just where it is. So one of the things that we have been seeing kind of on the opposite scale is while we're having these horrendous droughts out in the Midwest and out in India, elsewhere we're getting dumped on with rain. We've had a very rainy, wet winter. We've had a few of those, and and at the same time, down in the South and down in Asia, it's been drought. So the water is still there. It's just not in the same place.
Do we have any other questions from anyone? Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can direct message me as well. All right, here we go. So here's a question. We are concerned with industrialization, use of oil and plastic. However, is not continual war more of a threat to our Earth? So I think they're looking for your opinion on that.
So I think that, given what's going on right now across the entire environment, it's rough. I think, as far as where we put our resources, it's easier for people on the like on our level, the local, on the smaller scale. It's easier to control things like plastic use, turning down your thermostat. We do need to see a global wide shift in focus on where we kind of put our energy and how we get our energy. That's why solar and wind are so big now. Unfortunately, it's still in the fairly new stage, relatively new. In the grand scheme, it is newer technology. So as a result, not as many people having access to that. Those net benefits of using that technology haven't happened yet. So we have to get more people using those. Personally, I think I kind of treat the plastic disaster as a little bit of a higher priority, just because I know there's a lot I can do to keep that from happening. As far as the global temperature, that is quite a bit on a collective scale. Even with the little things that we can do those are still important to do. But personally, to me, the plastic is like, oh my gosh, anytime I buy something and it has plastic wrapping on it, I go, oh no, why did it
Yeah, I know exactly how you feel. I feel like it's unavoidable in a lot of ways, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a question about volcanic activity. What is the impact of volcanic eruptions? Do these cool the atmosphere?
So a lot of the volcanoes that exist are actually underwater. The Ring of Fire is actually a chain of volcanoes that occurs in the Pacific Ocean, and those will have minor activity, seismic activities. But as far as eruption, these are pretty small volcanoes, so they're not going to create big booming eruptions. Down in Hawaii, they have been having a lot of volcanic activity, and one of the things that they're experiencing from that is actually the islands are getting bigger. It's now we're not talking about miles upon miles of islands getting bigger, but anytime the lava spills into the ocean, it cools and it actually forms the island into a bigger chunk. Again, this is on a smaller scale, but volcanic eruptions can have an impact on heating up the atmosphere and heating up the air in general. I'm not super familiar on the science behind it and the studies, but there is a theory that because of the erratic weather conditions that we're having, kind of combined with the stronger storms that we're experiencing out in the ocean, those kind of are kind of mingling together to cause more frequent eruptions because the earth is and the land is being disturbed more easily. Like I said, my knowledge on that is very limited. I am not a volcanologist by any means, but compared to what we have done to the earth to warm it, I'd say we probably have the bigger impact.
Next question is, which animal species lived in New York during the Ice Age, and are any still here?
So unfortunately, most of our Ice Age species are gone. The giant sloth, this was a sloth that was about 12 feet tall, absolutely terrifying thought to me. We had the mastodons. There were big cats. New York and the US actually had a species of lion at one time. This was the Ice Age lion, North American lion. We had mammoths, which were another subspecies of mastodons. But unfortunately, for the most part, a lot of those animals are gone. They are part of the fossil record now. Elephants out in Africa, they are distant relatives of the mammoth. So, as far as up here, we don't really have much left except bones.
I actually have a follow-up question to that. Did most of those species go extinct very shortly after the end of the Ice Age that we know of, or were their lifetimes sort of extended and they went extinct due to other factors?
The most common theory is that it was both the Ice Age ending and a few other factors. This is one of those where it's kind of like the dinosaurs. What made the dinosaurs go extinct? Was it the asteroid? Was it they were outcompeted? So usually it's, the landscape could no longer suit their needs. And as a result, they just faded into non existence. There are a lot of efforts to clone these animals. Personally, to me, I think that's a little bizarre because we don't have an ice age now for them. So how would they thrive? But that's my opinion. As much as I would love to see a mammoth walking down the street, I don't know how that would work.
Yeah, I guess it's the same way we would struggle a lot being thrown into an ice age, so. All right. I'll say anyone else who has a question, please put it in the chat now. I'll give you a minute or two to do that. All right, Mary, it looks like we don't have any more questions. So I will say thank you to you. Your presentation was wonderful. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We really appreciate you spending your Thursday evening with us. Have a good night. Oh, wait, it does look like we have one more question. It just came in. If you don't mind, Mary.
Oh,
So, does climate change make a new ice age more or less likely to happen?
so I guess you could say there is no world, there's no realm on Earth where it's impossible. Maybe something dramatic happens. Maybe, who knows, maybe the Earth's orientation shifts and the axis shifts, and we do see another ice age. I would say it's not impossible. However, given kind of the trends that we have seen, I would say it is less likely that we will have an ice age anytime soon.
I guess food for thought, a good question to end on. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful night. And I hope you enjoyed Mary's talk.